I now request Dr. Ching to take over the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Seema. So welcome to session 4 of the second Rupkatha International Conference on Recent Advances in Interdisciplinary Humanities. Unfortunately, Dr. De Chavez will not be able to moderate the current session, so I will take over instead. So we were supposed to start at 12:15, however, it's 12:30. So we'll try to be more efficient with this session. So the theme of this session is animal studies. So for this session, there will be 4 panelists, including me. So the first to present will be me, followed by Vincent Pacheco, Alexandra Orbeta, and Swagata Singha Ray. Each panelist will be given a maximum of 10 minutes to present. I will be reminding the presenters on their last 2 minutes in order to wrap up their presentations accordingly. After the presentation, a question and answer session will be open. So before we start the presentation, I would like to remind the rest of the participants to put their mics on mute to minimize feedback and unwanted noise during the session. Okay, so I wish to start my presentation. The title of my presentation is Animal Loss in Times of Disaster, Examining Human Responses of Outrage and Grief. So in this presentation, I will discuss the gap in the discipline of sociology, particularly in the human-animal connection. So a number of attempts has been made to include animals in exploration in the humanities and social sciences. So this is a response to the gap where animals are much neglected entities in the said disciplines. There has been debates as to the inclusion of animals in scholarly discourses in the field of sociology. Notably, human exceptionalism has been one of the key ideological drivers which prevent a more inclusive consideration of animals in the study of our social world. The anthropocentric view of the world and society has put the needs and status of human above all other animals. So this line of thinking has implications on how humanity relates and interacts with animals in a broader context. In times of crisis, humans relegate animals as conveniently expendable or an inconvenient afterthought, which easily leads to instances of animal abandonment and even abuse, which I will further unpack in this presentation. So 4 decades ago, Bryant, 1979, raised the alarm on how the social sciences, particularly sociology, has failed to address the zoological component in human interaction and attendant social system. He then makes a compelling case for the concept of the zoological connection, or, and I quote, the influence of animals or their import for our social behavior, our relationship with other humans, and the directions which our social enterprise often takes. And in Peter Singer's work, Animal Liberation, he argues that we must bring non-human animals within our sphere of moral concern and cease to treat their lives as expendable for whatever trivial purposes we may have. George Herbert Mead's understanding of what is sociological has far-ranging implications on the exclusion of animals from further attention in the discipline. Mead defined the unique social capacities of human by denying these same capacities to non-human animals. It operates based on the following differentiations: that humans are conscious and can choose courses of actions. Animals are not conscious and operate only on instinct. Humans can communicate with symbols, animals cannot. And humans have language and create culture, while animals have neither language nor culture. And animals live only in the present, while humans have a sense of both past and future. So sociology generally does remain to be an anthropocentric area of study with the purpose of elevating the status, needs, and importance of humans above all other animals. So the superiority of humans over animals is at the heart of human exceptionalism. Carter and Charles, 2018, argue that human exceptionalism refers to the idea that the human species is exempt from natural constraints, primarily because of its scientific and technological achievements, and is evolutionarily unique because of its capacity for language and the capacities for meaning-making and cultural development that are emergent from this. So human exceptionalism is advance in needs the limitation of what ought to be sociological. Particularly, he asserted that animals are not part of the discipline of sociology because they lack the capacity for language, imagination, and even perception. Furthermore, he posits that only humans are capable of language and culture, and any semblance of purpose or even cognition from animals in needs perspective is a foolish projection on our part, which we would abandon once we really understood animals. So the alleged uniqueness of humans, therefore, is considered the primary demarcation of what ought to be sociological. And this line of thinking has far-reaching consequences, the most critical of which is the erasure of animals from the function of society and the intensification of speciesism. So Irvine successfully captures this glaring gap in our understanding of the role of animals in human life. She reveals, in light of the tremendous influence of animals on culture and their numerous roles in society, their omission from sociological study has given us an incomplete picture of the social world. Furthermore, there is a resistance from sociology to consider animals as an oppressed group, as it purportedly diminishes the notion of oppression. Speciesism, just like sexism and racism, is a form of oppression and is also institutionalized. It is the exaltation of humans over all other species of animals, or the belief that humans are of higher moral worth than animals. Singer argues speciesism is prejudice or attitude of bias in favor of the interests of members of one's own species and against those of members of other species. And there have been a number of attempts to include animals in sociological exploration. So this is a response to the scholarly chasm where animals are much neglected entities in sociology and the omission of animals in the discipline in general. So why are animals a part of and parcel of our social world? Carter and Charles provide the following reasons. First, contrary to Mead's assertion, animals do have a sense of self, and the relationship of human and animals are depicted as a form of intersubjectivity. In addition, animal and human relations are influenced by changing social relations. And second, it is asserted that sociology is imbued with a moral and political duty to attend to animals in the same way it entangles itself with different forms of oppressed and vulnerable groups. And lastly, animals do occupy a position in human social life. Particularly, societies would not have taken the form that they do had it not been for human connections with other animals. Ultimately, animals are participants in the formation of the selfhood of humans. So the context of the present study is this. In November 2020, Metro Manila experienced the devastation of Typhoon Vamco, the 21st cyclone to ravage the Philippines for the said year. Individuals were evacuated to prevent further loss of life from the onset of the typhoon. However, some families have unfortunately abandoned their companion animals in the vicinity, and media reports have shown animals stuck in rooftops or swimming in raging flood waters. Fortunately, some companion animals were later reunited with their owners. However, there were instances when animals were left in cages or leashed as the floodwaters gradually consumed the cities. So although animal abandonment is a criminal offense in the Philippines, it is undeniable that in times of crisis and disasters, the said behavior is quite prevalent. So the Philippine Animal Welfare Society issued a reminder to the public to give animals a fighting chance during disasters. And when PAWS returned to Provident Village, which is one of the villages affected with the typhoon, they discovered corpses of animals that were still chained or caged. And that is the focal point of this paper or this project. So the Philippine Animal Welfare Society is a non-profit organization dedicated to humane treatment of animals. So on November 13, 2020, the organization, through their social media page, through Facebook, shared a series of images of animal death. So although a few animals were rescued, some were unable to escape the rising floodwaters because they were chained or caged. So when these animals were left shackled, they were inevitably condemned to their untimely and gruesome demise. So while the owners of these animals were preoccupied with saving themselves, they unfortunately overlooked that their companion animals are solely dependent on their care and attention. So this is possibly the reason why the organization released a public reminder to give an animals a fighting chance during disasters. So simply put, social media posts from this organization is the focus point or the focal point of the project, particularly the analysis of the comments through computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software, particularly in Vivo. Overall, there are 5,251 comments that were successfully collected and subsequently analyzed, which forms the data set of this inquiry. So a word cloud was produced based on the comments that were collected, which is shown on the slide. Simply put, a word cloud transforms textual data into visual form in order to get a better grasp of the commonly occurring words in the data set. So the most frequent terms that occurred in the data set are the following: irresponsible with 311 instances, pinakawalan, which is in translation, which is to set free, with 237 instances, to be helped with 157 instances, and neglected with 138 instances. So a deeper examination of these highly occurring terms highlight the dominant responses towards the image of animal death. So based on the data excerpts, which I was not able to put on the slide because of time limitations, there are two dominant sentiments in relation to the situation. The first is the theme of outrage against negligence of pet owners who abandon their companion animals. And the second one in the data set is compassionate treatment of animals. So this is primarily articulated through calls for helping the animals in times of crisis. So the term to be helped or matulungan, that is, citizens should be part of solutions in taking care of community animals, and abandoning the animals is a form of abuse, but this behavior actually occurs quite often. So just to summarize, so the presentation highlights the gap in the study of animals in the context of the social sciences. As it currently stands, the dominance of human exceptionalism has prevented a more inclusive recognition of animals as part of our social world. And this also influences the everyday treatment of animals and subsequently the different forms of oppression that they are subjected to. Irvine points out that concerns for animals does not imply the lack of concerns for humans. However, a lack of concerns for animals often comes with disrespect for other people. So I assert that animals do occupy a social position and is deeply involved in social relations. Hence, they deserve further scholarly attention. Sociology as a discipline in the social sciences is particularly ironic because of its eagerness to include the plight of every human minority, yet it resists the consideration of the plight of animals. So this concludes my presentation. So now I move, so the next presentation is this. So the second presentation is titled Animality and Entanglement, the Gothicized Anthropological Machine in Bram Stoker's short fiction by Mr. Vincent Pacheco, a faculty member of the Department of Literature from De La Salle University, Manila. He holds an MA in English Studies from the University of Macau, and his primary research interests include critical theory, populism, and visual culture. So I now turn the floor to Mr. Pacheco.
Oh, sorry. Oh, hello, everyone. So my presentation is titled Animality and Entanglement. And what my paper tries to do is that it closely reads what constitutes the non-human vis-a-vis animality in Bram Stoker's oft-overlooked short stories, namely The Squaw and the Burial of the Rats. The Squaw is a tale about an American who murders a kitten in cold blood, and in turn, the mother grotesquely avenges her kitten. The anxiety of interspecies relationship is evident in this text, and I argue that this anxiety is what allows what Agamben calls as the anthropological machine to operate. So in The Animal That Therefore That I Am, Derrida intriguingly starts his essay by exploring if animals can also look at humans, and he suggests that the non-human can also bear the gaze. Derrida understands that animals are not objects, and that there is a particular language that the cat used. Donna Haraway follows Derrida, and she polemically responds to this by saying that he failed a simple obligation of companion species. He did not become curious about what the cat might actually be doing, feeling, thinking, or perhaps making available to him and looking back at him that morning. She continues by saying Derrida instead, quote, nurtured an entanglement and a generative interruption called response. But how does this notion of entanglement affects itself to how humans look at animals and vice versa? Haraway suggests that this can be seen in how we think about the notion of response. So given that, in this paper, I suggest a generative way of examining how animals can look back by exploring how beings respond in older works of fiction. It is in this spirit that I also look back the same way animals look back at us, by revisiting and retracing how might a Gothic tradition inform us on the possibilities of animals in representation. So in Agamben's book titled The Open Man and Animal, he speculates on the broad philosophical conceptualizations of man, animal, and the boundary between these two categories. Agamben traces this division to how the foundation of Western thought has categorized human life and thereby connecting it to his Homo Sacer project, where he theorizes on bare life, which is a result of the division between Zoe and bias. I won't dwell on this too much, but Agamben conceptualizes what he calls the anthropological machine, which is supposedly an apparatus that functions by means of an exclusion, which is also always capturing life, and an inclusion, which is also always already an exclusion. He continues by also theorizing that this anthropological machine functions in modern times by excluding as not yet human an already human being from itself, that is, by animalizing the human, which is done by isolating the non-human within the human. So in other words, this anthropological machine is what enables the arbitrary exclusion of life from other forms of life, thereby providing a way to govern categorizations of life. Although Agamben's thoughts in his book is not specifically related to the growing discourse on animal studies or even the Gothic, I opportunistically reflect on how the notion of the anthropological machine might be expanded by contemplating its relationship with how Donna Haraway thinks about the notion of entanglement. So for Haraway, individual animals, human and non-human, are themselves entangled assemblages of relatings, knotted at many scales and times with other assemblages, organic or not. Individuated critters matter. They are mortal and fleshy nothings, not ultimate units of being. Kinds matter. They are also mortal and fleshy nothings, not typological units of being. That is to say that it is inherently difficult to establish the caesura, or the divide between man and animal, precisely because humans and non-humans are essentially entangled. What I suggest then is that the anthropological machine operates by attempting to remove these entangled relations to establish the very divide which governs forms of life. But as my reading of the Squaw and the Burl of the Rats will show, the Gothicized anthropological machine has, in some way, failed to disentangle the human and non-human, thereby amplifying the horrific representations of the human in those texts. What makes these representations grotesque and intolerable is the idea that there is no caesura that divides the man and animal. The inability to disentangle from the fixation that there is a divide is what makes these stories I read inherently Gothic. So Bram Stoker's The Squaw is a tale about a couple who travels to Nuremberg, Germany for a honeymoon. During their trip, they meet Hutchin, who is an American adventurer, and they all visit the Burg, or Nuremberg Castle, where the famous Iron Maiden of Nuremberg lies. It's a torture device where when you close the door, when you're inside it and you close the door, the spikes will impale you. Here the party sees a great black cat lying stretched in the sun. And Hutchin then picked up a moderate-sized pebble to help the play. And as they saw the black cat playing with her little kitten, Hutchin intends to drop it near the kitten, so the kitten and the mother would wonder where it came from. The kitten dies as a result of this. And while the circumstances of the kitten's grotesque and horrific death is manifestly Gothic, what is arguably Gothic about this is the response of the kitten's mother. So the black cat cast a swift upward glance, and we saw her eyes like green fire fixed an instant on LSP Hutchin. And then her attention was given to the kitten, which lay still with just a quiver of her tiny limbs, while a thin red stream trickled from a gaping wound. And now I won't finish reading this book. But similar to how Derrida speaks about his cat that looked back at him without the use of human language, the black cat also responded by subjecting Elias to its gaze. The gaze here, however, is different, as the cat's gaze here is a response to a human being who adamantly believes in the divide between the human and the non-human. And because there's a divide, that's what enabled him to kill the cat by dropping a pebble. But what makes this scene particularly Gothic is that the inherent humanity seen in the black is that we see that there's a certain humanity in the black cat who is grieving and gazing in a way that a human being would, in response to loss. The black cat attempted to climb the wall to reach and kill Elias Hutchin, but he fails. But the cat eventually succeeds when he attacks the custodian that was holding the spike door open, while Hutchin is inside the Iron Maiden, which again is a torture device. Of course, the cat was able to avenge the kitten, but the cat was horribly cut into at the end of the story. But we see more of these Gothic animals in the Burial of the Rats. So the Burial of the Rats is a story about an Englishman who ventures into Paris, which he describes like a living animal, remarking that Paris alone is the analogical apotheosis of an octopus, a city where you see radiating many long arms with innumerable tentaculae. And in the center rises a gigantic head with a comprehensive brain and keen eyes to look on every side and sensitive to ear, and a voracious mouth to swallow. This opening sets this urban space as a Gothic zone, where the Gothicized version of Harrowing entanglement occurs. The unnamed protagonist here wanders to the holiest of the city, holy of the holies of the City of Dust, which turns out to be a poverty-stricken place filled with shanties, scavengers, and cutthroats. Inside the hut, he first encounters the rats described as carnivorous. Like the black cat in the squall, the rats found in the story also look back at humans. But the difference here is that the presence of these very critters in itself is abominable and repulsive. The entanglement here is present when human bones and when human bones and the critters exist side by side, as if there is no boundary of what constitutes death and decay for the human and non-human. Now, what this scene embodies then is a Gothicized rendition of entanglement, where the companionship has led vermin to consume the old woman to the bone, whereas Haraway's notion of entanglement should potentially be called degothicize the caesura. But in this case, the anthropological machine also failed to articulate this divide because of this very entanglement, as the isolation of the non-human within the human becomes impossible. So I conclude by reading this, and as Croft and Hatter would emphasize, rats in the story were treated as a commodity, much as the working class were themselves, to be captured, sold, groomed, and killed as needed. But what this signifies in the context of the paper is the lack of a clear boundary between vermin and the human, and this demonstrates a form of entanglement between them. While Agamben's anthropological machine should have created the conditions possible for the exclusion of animals from the human, what is shown here instead through my reading of The Squaw and The Burial of the Rats is how the act of returning the gaze blurs these very boundaries, thereby opening the possibility that a Gothicized version of the anthropological machine instead articulates the pervasive fear of humans, which is the idea that there is no caesura between man and animal. This ends my presentation, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pacheco. So what a wonderful presentation. So the third presentation is titled Of Crows and Humans, The Affective Economy of Mourning and Grieving by Miss Alexandra Margarita Orbeta, who received her AB Literature from De La Salle University, Manila. Her research interests include literary theory, cultural studies, and 19th century literature. So I now turn over the floor to Miss Orbeta.
Hello, everyone. My paper is entitled Of Crows and Humans, the Affective Economy of Mourning and Grieving. This paper aims to examine the representation of animals in Max Porter's Grief is the Thing with Feathers, a multi-awarded novel about an academic struggle on coping with the grief of losing his wife. Previous scholarship on Grief is the Thing with Feathers focuses on an anthropocentric approach to grief and melancholia. However, I argue these emotions can be approached through an examination of the crow, a fantastical talking bird who makes itself known during the funeral, against the human protagonists of the novel. Sigmund Freud introduces in his essay, The Unconscious, the notion that what is repressed from consciousness is not the feeling, but the idea to which the feeling was first temporarily linked. Psychoanalysis presents the movements or associations in which feelings takes us to various levels of signification, which cannot be completely admitted in the present. Sarah Ahmed calls this the rippling effect of emotions. She posits that emotions are not simply something that I or we have, Rather, it is through emotions or how we respond to objects and others that surfaces or boundaries are made, that I and we are shaped by and even take the shape of through our contact with others. Emotions produce the very surfaces and boundaries that allow the individual and the social to be delineated as if they were objects. My paper is grounded particularly on Sarah Ahmed's examination on how emotions work to shape the surfaces of individual and collective bodies by reading texts that circulate in the public domain, which work by aligning subjects with collectives by attributing others as the source of our feelings. I use Max Porter's Grief is the Thing with Feathers to consider how emotions operate to produce and share bodies in action through their orientations towards others. I will examine how feelings such as grief and melancholia are circulated through signs, most notably the crow as a sticky figure of grief, transformed into a creature that is neither myth nor beast. I critically analyze in this paper how the novel blurs the boundary that separates humans and beasts through its representation of animal emotion. Central to my argument is Ines Sondra's idea that the uncanny is the thing with feathers. She writes that the uncanny disturbingly evokes simultaneously the primal scene and the death scene. The moments of encounter between the crow and the humans generates a mode to cope with melancholia and grief until they reach acceptance. Lastly, I look at how the author's experimentation of form constructs a poetics of mourning and melancholia that is meant to evoke the spectral presence of the dead. This hybridization of prose and poetry also performatively imitates affective and emotional responses to personal loss. By decentralizing grief into an animalistic lens, the crow becomes a device through which humans can recontextualize their personal tragedy by allowing them to simultaneously confront, experience, and interrogate loss until they recover. The affective economy and its production of the uncanny experience. In the cultural politics of emotion, Sarah Ahmed explores how emotions can move through the movement or circulation of objects. She goes on to explain that such objects become sticky or saturated with affect as sites of personal and social tension. Stickiness signifies to how affects such as pain, hate, and disgust attach themselves to objects. Inversely, people thereby associate these affects with these objects. Additionally, stickiness also points to how affects that got stuck to an object also stick to other objects in turn. She primarily uses the idea of stickiness to help shape the relationship between objects of fear and their capacity to affect other objects and bodies by expanding the mobility of some bodies and containing others. In the case of grief is the thing with feathers, this results in an affective economy of grief, where grief could be anyone or anywhere. The crow has affects attached to it, and in turn, has the capacity to produce other affects related to mourning and loss. I ruminate on how grief triggers Ines Sondra's idea of the uncanny experience. She specifies that this happens with disturbing moments dominated by unexpected and unusual powerful projective identification. When something happens which for a moment threatens to become overwhelming and deeply disorienting to the analyst, this results in moments where what is not mine is experienced as mine. I put forth that the uncanny experience functions as a wall between the subject and the full extent of grief, thereby allowing the subject to experience loss at its most primal form. In my reading of the novel, the crow's intrusion in the family's lives is a crossing of the boundary between the self and non-self. The crow as an animal is the closest representation for the repressed feelings the characters possess. Grief is the thing with feathers begins in the wake of a woman's funeral, with her husband desperately trying to find a sense of normalcy again. This is a quote lifted from the dad's perspective during his wife's wake. It is at this point that the crow arrives at the family's doorstep and declares that he won't leave them until they don't need him anymore. The uncanny moment begins at the arrival of the crow. The arrival of the crow triggers the primal scene and the death scene, where the dad and the boys multiply the metaphors of the body in order to postpone the confrontation of their loss. Through identifying with the bird, the family is able to recontextualize their loss. The crow is a sticky animal that possesses the ability to generate and distribute new affects. From their first meeting alone, Dad gratefully succumbs into a restful sleep. The following encounters between Crow, Dad, and the boys slowly work towards the family accepting their loss and honoring it. The novel is an experimental amalgamation of different forms. Space and time are more like tremors of something akin to Ahmed's idea of the rippling effect of emotions. The text is sometimes told in prose or poetry, and other times text is so disjointed that the words seem to performatively imitate the affective and emotional responses to personal loss. This quote is one of those examples. Attached to the crow are the things humans regress to when they are going through grief. It is an omen of sorts and is like an animal in the way that it is loud and brutal. It scavenges and pecks at wounds and the dead. It is also savage and wild in the way that things internally become completely dismantled when filled with negative affects such as loss, anger, and grief. The novel shows the failure of language in articulating the full spectrum of emotion by blurring the boundaries between human and non-human emotion. The result is a text that both muddles and clarifies what the characters are going through. Grief desolates everything in its path. In the novel, objects around the house remind Dad of his wife, and in turn, they generate affects of him missing his wife. He says here, grief is all-encompassing. It has seeped into the house and its occupants. The whole place is heavy mourning, every surface dead mum, every crayon, tractor, coat, welly, covered in a film of grief. Down the dead mum stairs, plinkety-plink, curled claws whisper, down to Daddy's recently mum and Dad's bedroom. The family views recovery as a form of betrayal. Dad says, quote, moving on as a concept is for stupid people because any sensible person knows grief is a long-term project. I refuse to rush. The pain that is thrust upon us, let no man slow or speed or fix. Gradually, through the crow's counseling, the pain abates, the boys grow up, and Dad allows himself to love again. When the family no longer needed Crow, he takes his leave and flies away. The animal turns into a symbol of recovery, signifying that although loss endures, grief subsides to set them to free them eventually. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Alexa. Okay, wonderful presentation. Next, we have the fourth presentation is titled Posthumanism and the New World, Interrogating the Collapse of Subjectivity and Species Boundary, and Jeff VanderMeer's Borne by Swagata Singha Ray from Gurudas College, Kolkata. So I now turn over the floor to Ms. Ray.
Good afternoon, sir. It's actually 1 o'clock over here, so good afternoon, sir. Actually, there has been a certain change in my title. It's Humanism and Posthumanism, Ethically Interrogating the Man and Animal Divide.
Okay. That's noted.
Okay. Should I continue, sir?
Yes. You may now share your presentation if you have one.
Yeah, I'll just read out. Thank you. So in this paper, I explore the possibilities of accommodation and hospitality which posthuman philosophy provides in conceptualizing the position of authority. I attempt a genealogical survey of the posthuman thought, tracing its origin in the writings of Ihab Hassan and Michel Foucault, and have explored how posthuman thought rectifies the anthropocentric exclusivist thought of the Renaissance humanism. The paper will explore the theoretical relationship between the posthuman thought and the condition of postmodernity, and will dwell into the possibilities which the emancipator politics of these two schools of thoughts provide to the marginal and liminal identities. Building on the writing of Derrida and Agamben, I further argue how posthumanism can rationalize the way in which the anthropocentric worldview looks at the animal as the other, questioning the positioning and relevance of speciesism and species boundary. Also, the issue of agency has been interrogated in this research presentation through the writings of Bruno Latour and the new materialist philosophers like Catherine Hayles and Karen Barrett, while differentiating posthumanism and transhumanism. I also would like to argue for a new mode of conceptualizing of the other, which abolishes the hierarchical view of anthropocentric conception of non-human, instead views the other from the lens of companionship, borrowing from the ideas of companionship and Cthulhu of Donna Haraway. And my presentation finally is an attempt to expand the humanist exclusionary boundaries and is an exercise in developing a post-human ethics through which the category of human can be radically questioned and can be made more hospitable. So I would like to start like this. The archy of the posthuman philosophy can be traced through the epistemic shift brought about in the traditional metaphysics of the West by the post-structuralist and postmodern aesthetics and theory, in the shift in the discursive practices concerning human subjectivity, which Ihab Hassan terms as the more postmodern turn. The posthuman philosophy is a critical stream diverging out of the network and the deconstructive politics of the post-structuralism, and postmodernity adopts a non-dualistic approach to the concept of being and subjectivity. It further offers a new epistemology which is not anthropocentric and clearly a deviant from the Cartesian dualism. Lyotard defines postmodernism as incredulity towards meta-narrative, and he further observes with the obsolescence of the meta-narrative apparatus of legitimation corresponds most notably the crisis of metaphysical philosophy and of the university institution which in the past relied on it. The posthuman critique of the human subjectivity discredits the system of anthropocentric characteristics of enlightenment and humanism, which venerates the idea that proper study of man is man. In 1977, it was Ihab Hassan who initiated the discourse of posthuman philosophy as he published Prometheus as a Performer Towards a Posthumanist Culture, a university masque in 5 scenes. This essay is often credited as the first in anticipation of the advent of a post-humanist culture within the critical humanities. In this seminal essay, Hassan propounds, at present, posthumanism may appear variously as a dubious neologism, at the latest slogan, or simply another image of man's recurrent self-hate. Yet posthumanism may also hint at potential in our culture, hint at a tendency struggling to become more than a trend. We need to understand that 500 years of humanism may be coming to an end as humanism transforms itself into something that we must call helplessly posthumanism. The politics of liberalism. The politics of liberal humanism, which initiated anthropocentrism, revolves around the idea that humans are sovereign and self-sufficient. It continuously tries to efface the politics of exclusion, which is initiated to constitute the human. But ironically, the notion of the human and the historical phenomena of humanism have been continued by reiterative subjugation of symbolic others. The alterity in various modalities has served as the emblematic borderlines of who and what would be measured as human. In the shifting terrains of the other non-Europeans, women, homosexuals, freaks, animals, and automaton, among the others, have historically featured contrary condition to humanity. As Bradiotti puts it in Metamorphosis Towards a Materialistic Theory of Becoming, postmodernity is notoriously the age of proliferating differences. The devalued others, which constituted specular complement of the modern subject woman, the ethnic or the radicalized, and nature or earth others, return with vengeance. The posthuman philosophy emerges out of the embers of vengeance of the other, which has been relegated as the inferior taxonomy in the binary opposition of man. And the posthuman ethics recognizes the voices of subjectivities which have been historically condescending to the sphere of the other. In contrast to the politics of exclusion and repression, posthumanism recognizes and becomes hospitable to the other. One can borrow Michael Serres' understanding of the parasite to delineate the connection between human and the other, which posthuman ontology initiates. For the liberal humanist school of thought, the continuity of the individual as autonomous and self-contained is paramount. Contrary to such narcissistic humanism, Serres, in his seminal text, Parasite, suggests that the other as the parasites are intrinsic in any structure. The human parasite codependency and reliance are much more widespread than humanism admits. Contrary to the discourse of exclusive humanism, Serres believes that the dependency often isn't an unconstructive condition. Rather, it functions as a catalyst, a thermal exciter, a prospect for change. What Serres proposes echoes the posthumanist discourse as the parasite other provides the self with prospects of extensions and becoming fluid in intersubjectivity. This intersubjectivity is an inclusive drive, also informs Hassan's investigation of the post-human condition. The intersubjectivity, which I was actually talking about, to quote Hassan, the cardinal question, of course, remains how in practice to found a human or post-human vision, call it inclusively human or an anxious order of knowledge. Hassan is extremely aware of the dual potency of the condition of the inclusive, which in order to include, hyphenated, also consequently X hyphenated again includes others, and hence he graphed some of the certain central points of humanism, such as the incessant deconstruction of the subjectivity of human, a candor through the possibilities of a post, and also, as posited earlier, a post-dualistic approach which ensures through recognitions rather than a forced absorption. This brings into interrogation the notion of non-human agency. Donna Haraway has extensively engaged with epistemological, ethical, and political tenacity of non-human agency. In her book, Primate Visions, Haraway examines the white capitalist patriarchy and makes it nearly impossible to avoid the trap of an appropriationist logic of domination built into the nature-culture binarism, as Haraway puts it. Such an algorithm reductively frames the world as a thing, not an agent. Nature is the only raw material of culture, appropriated, preserved, enslaved, exalted, or otherwise made flexible for disposal by culture in the logic of capitalist colonialism, as Haraway talks about this in her book. And she acknowledges the primates other than humans as authors, which she calls them, and accredits their material semiotic agency. This agency of non-human animals, however, need not to be a conscious one to be recognized. One may take example of the experiment of Gordon Gallup conducted in the year 1979 to determine the operationalized self-consciousness in non-human animals. He conducted the experiment by putting mirrors in visionary field of various animals. He then studied their reactions to their own reflections. The findings of experiment indicated that only a very few animals, including chimpanzees, but not monkeys, for example, verified the aptitude of self-recognition and self-consciousness. There can be different possible ways of registering agency, and as Latour points out through his listing in this concluding pages of An Inquiry into the Modes of Existence, he does not catalog agentive beings, but rather he talks about the modes of existence, each of which has its own felicity, infelicity conditions and types of being to institute. This recognition of multiplicity of modes of existence makes it possible for the post-human thought to recognize the differences in simultaneity and be cognizant of the possible appropriation which intra-species relations might inflict on the animal, the hybrid, or the automaton. The recognition of various modes of existence also ensured against the homohegemonization under a proper noun like animal. Derrida, in his influential book, comments on this act of hubris, the blatant dilution of differences and the ruthless silencing of the other.
10 minutes. I would you may start wrapping up your presentation.
Yes, my fellow scholars here have actually, my fellow speakers, they have actually talked about Agamben and Derrida, and I have listened very carefully. And that is also what I also wanted to point about. However, I will try to wrap it up. To conclude, I would like to stress on the idea of interspecies companionship, biotic and abiotic, what Karen Barrett called interactions or the natural constitutions, as she talks about them. And this is an active becoming which cannot be and should not be addressed using any linear ethical pattern. The animal is not a straightforward antithesis to human, nor can the animal be rendered as all transparent, as Carrie Wolf points out as the same in the same manner as well. And I would just like to say that any such distinction and extension of moral and ethical treatment grounded on the criteria of perceptive and participatory behavior is not only exclusionary, but also discriminatory and continues the humanist utilitarian perception of nature and animal. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Ray. These presentations are truly interesting. So now let's move to the Q&A session. If you wish to ask our panelists a question, please type your question in the chat box and also indicate who the question is addressed to. And also people from the panel may also ask other panelists of any questions that they may have. Any questions from the attendees and the panelists? Okay, so it's already, let me just check. So it's already 1:19. Our session was supposed to end at 1:15. So since there are no more questions, we are at the end of this session. I would like to thank our session panelists, Vincent, Alexandra, and Swagata for their very insightful presentations. Likewise, I would like to thank those who participated in this session. I would like to also acknowledge the wonderful work done by the conference organizers in making this event possible. Thank you and see you in the next session. So I now turn over the floor to the conference organizers.
Thank you, Dr. Chavez, for the extremely enriching session. Ended well in time, very meaningful, very thought-provoking. Thank you so much. With this, I hand over the floor to Mr. Rahul, who's the moderator for the sessions 5 and 6. Over to you, Rahul.
Thank you, Ms. Seema Singha. And am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So I welcome you all to session 5, day 1 of the Rupkatha International Open Conference 2021. So it's a pleasure for me to invite Professor Swagata Baduri, the chair who will be chairing this session. Professor Baduri is affiliated with the Center for English Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, India. His research interests include literary and cultural theory, popular culture, translation and comparative literature studies, and the cultural history of colonial Bengal. His latest books are Post-Coloniality, European Transactions with Bengal from the 13th to the 19th century, published by Bloomsbury 2020. And the forthcoming book, A Critical History of Bengal Literature by Orient Blackswan in the year 2022. His edited books include Transcultural Negotiations of Gender, Studies in Longing or Belonging, published by Springer in the year 2015, Literary Theory and Introductory Reader, Perspectives on Comparative Literature and Culture in the Age of Globalization, Negotiating Globalization, and Translating Power. I welcome you, Professor, to chair the session, and over to you for the further proceedings.
Right. So thank you very much. I must thank the organizers for having me over to chair this session. I understand that it's just a 1-hour session in which we have 4 presentations, and I've been told that each presentation should not last more than 12 minutes. So let's stick to the time so that 12 4s are 48, and after that we'll have 12 more minutes for Q&A and discussion if there are any questions. So without much ado, let us begin with the first presentation. And the first presentation is, and the session is on post methodologies in history. That's the general rubric of the whole session. And the first paper is Methodology versus Theory, Historical Approaches and the Problematic Field of the Humanities in Postmodernism. And the co-presenters are Tetiana Vlasova, who is a professor and head of philology and translation department at the Dnipro National University of Railway Transport, Ukraine. Olga Vlasova, who's a candidate of philosophical science and associate professor at philosophy and sociology at the same university, and Larisa Matsneyuk, who is an associate professor of economics and management department in the same university. So thank you very much, and let's start without any further delay. And you have 12 minutes. Please stick to your time. Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt, Professor. We do not have the first presenters. We do not have them with us yet. So we'll move to the second presenters.
Okay.
If that's okay.
So, yes, right. So we move on to the second presentation then. And in case the first presenter doesn't turn up, so in that case, we can have 15 minutes per presentation. So it's Arnav Dashgupta, and his presentation is called The Author is Dead, Long Live the Author, Postmodern Meta-Narratives and the Performance of the Author